Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I'm here, as always, with my dapper colleague, friend, and co-host, Mr. Timothy O'Toole. What is up, Tim?
What is up, Brian? I'm dressed up for the ECTI training in Alexandria, Virginia today.
Tim's had his professor hat on today. He always has his
Exactly.
professor hat on, but today, even more so, he had to actually wear it, so not just figuratively. So good to see you, Professor O'Toole, safely back from a trip abroad. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. We delayed our normal recording in part because of some international travel and other scheduling issues that we had the last couple of weeks, but happy to be back. Bringing you our first episode here in November of Embargoed. Thanks to everybody as always, for tuning in, for the feedback that we got in the last couple weeks since our last episode. Unclear whether this may be our only episode in November, considering that we have the Thanksgiving holidays coming up, but we are recording this here on November 8th. We have a relatively, I think, compact agenda for you today. We're going to hit on a lot of China content today, and then one interesting development and an ongoing criminal case in SDNY that we haven't touched on in a while that we wanted to bring up, and I think that's about it. So, without any further delay, let me just jump right in. So, as always, we are not providing legal advice. We're not sharing any confidential information. All opinions are mine or Tim's. If you disagree with them, please blame us. If you like the pod, please subscribe. You can find us anywhere you get your content. Please leave us a rating, hopefully a 5-star rating, and spread the word about Embargoed. So, with that, let me do a quick rundown of what we're going to cover today, and then maybe just some quick thoughts before we jump in. So, we're gonna stick with a thematic through line that we have had on the last couple episodes. We're going to do a lot of cyber today and a lot of China, and so we're going to start with the new interim final rule that was rolled out by BIS a couple weeks ago on cybersecurity items. We're going to cover also some other actions taken by BIS and the End User Review Committee on some additional entity list designations. And OFAC just jumped into the fray again today with some more cyber-related designations. So continuing a theme of late. So that's going to be kind of topic number one. We're going to touch on Huawei, a couple of interesting articles that have been out recently on activities of Huawei on the amount of authorized and perhaps unauthorized U.S. origin items that Huawei has still been able to obtain since the entity list restrictions were tightened on them last year. And then a brief word about China Telecom and a pretty consequential action that has finally been taken by the FCC with respect to China Telecom's licensing status here in the US. And then we're going to pivot away from China briefly to talk about the Hawk Bank case and a recent ruling by the Second Circuit in that case, and whether that now paves the way to trial in that case, and also some broader potential implications of that ruling, I think. And then finally in the lightning round, just one topic, we're going to circle back to one that we touched on the last time, which is uh, Taiwan, and in particular, just checking in on a couple of other developments in the past few weeks with respect to Taiwan and how the U.S. and China are kind of um, positioned sort of at an increasingly fraught point with respect to Taiwan and what may be next. So before we jump in, Tim, any thoughts before we get going here?
No, I think, we are continuing on the same themes. We've got China and we've got cybersecurity, and I think that's going to cover most of what we're going to talk about today with a little bit of Iran sprinkled in.
Yeah, no real news on JCPOA 2.0, so we're leaving that aside for the day. But yeah, so without any further ado, let's jump right into topic number one. So as I mentioned, um, a couple weeks ago, this is now a couple weeks since it's been 3 weeks since we recorded. So on October 20, BIS announced that they were releasing an interim final rule establishing controls on certain cybersecurity items that can be used for malicious cyber activities. So this is interesting, and as I mentioned, and as we'll talk about a bit more, there were a few days later, there were some entity listings that also relate to malicious cyber activity targeting entities in Israel, Russia, Singapore, and then just today, actually, OFAC got into the fray and designated some entities, mostly in, I believe, Russia, Latvia, Estonia, that are also implicated in malicious cyber activities. So, still a lot of activity in this space. But to talk for a moment and just to quickly kind of recap for those who missed it, the interim final rule. I think this is interesting for a few reasons, and I'll just kind of run through them quickly. So this, for those who aren't following this, this is not a very broad sweep to this rule, as one can imagine by what I just described, sort of cybersecurity items that are pretty narrowly defined under the regs. But this is sort of a final step or a potential close to final step in implementing something that has been was teed up under Wassenaar and under the Wassenaar arrangement many years ago and was debated and proposed in the U.S. and then the U.S. BIS and company were not happy with where we netted out with that, so went back to Wassenaar to sort of the Wassenaar group to sort of renegotiate. And that was now 2017, and then finally coming out of that, this is essentially meant to kind of implement the what was agreed to there in terms of some of these controls and cybersecurity items. Interestingly, so this is mostly going to impact, and again, I encourage everybody to take a look at the rule who maybe has not looked at this interim final rule. As I mentioned, it was released October 21. The comment period is running. It's a 45-day comment period, so it expires on December 6th. The interim final rule is scheduled to go into effect January 19, so early 2022. A couple of things that I would note. So this is mostly impacting category 4 and 5 under the Commerce Control List. It is, as I said, sort of an implementation of a Wassenaar arrangement regime relating to these types of items. It has taken the U.S. a while to come up with changes to the regs that will sort of are believed to satisfy, sort of, in particular, sort of private industry and many different government actors as well. There are some end user and end use restrictions that go along with these, as you can imagine. And there is in fact a new license exception that goes along with these rules, which is the ACE license exception, Authorized Cybersecurity Exports, ACE. They never fail to come up with pithy abbreviations for these things. So the ACE license exception is now going to be in effect, assuming this stands as part of the final rule. And so notably, that license exception is not going to be available to certain countries, including countries subject to U.S. arms embargoes. So China, this will not be. Nobody will be able to avail themselves of that exception with respect to China. And as I mentioned, there are some end user and end use restrictions that go along, both government and non-government end users, depending on the context. And so there are quite a few kind of moving parts to this rule, but we did want to highlight it for a couple of reasons. Again, I think it's interesting that now, again, the Wassenaar arrangement that was negotiated that this is implementing has been this is now 4 years in the past, so it's been quite some time since that was put in place. And this rule is now just being rolled out. So it'll be interesting to see because there was such a, I don't know if uproar is quite the right word, but there was a lot of criticism, I think, of the original rule that was rolled out back in, I think it was 2015 to implement the original kind of Wassenaar arrangement that was reached back in almost a decade ago now. So it'll be interesting to see whether this is really going to fly and pass muster or how the comments are going to come in to look at this. And then obviously this is, consistent with everything that we've been seeing, the recent OFAC guidance that we've been talking about on the pod and some of the other activities that we've been talking about a lot of late. This is just another vector to get at in particular, China and the use of these types of cybersecurity items for malicious cyber activity and surveillance in particular that may be used to perpetrate human rights abuses and otherwise. So this is somewhat interesting, and I think important from the perspective of this is another kind of aspect of the holistic strategy that the U.S. kind of export control and trade and national security regime is bringing to bear to sort of get at the same problem. We've touched on it from many different angles here. This is a pretty powerful one, obviously, and with this new license exception and the fact that authorizations and licenses are still going to be required to China and certain other more highly controlled countries, that is, I think, not surprising, but pretty significant that this is now going to go into effect. So let me just pause there and sort of toss it to Tim for any thoughts he may have on this.
Yeah, so what I like about this new interim rule is in part that BIS was appears to have been very considered about this. That is, they came out with a proposed rule. They got a lot of criticism for the proposed rule in terms of its workability. And they went back to the drawing board and came up with something that, it's very topical, obviously, but it is important to get this right. And I think the outcry from industry was in part because a lot of the items that you need, particularly with respect to cybersecurity, uh, companies need these items in order to test their systems. Unfortunately, they're also the same items that hackers use to hack the systems. And so coming up with a system of workable controls that allows industry to protect itself, but at the same time puts restrictions on the availability of these items is hard. And so it took a while, but it probably should have taken a while when things are hard. And hopefully this rule will fit the bill better than the last one. From a quick read, it looks to me like it probably will. That it is, that this new system of ECCNs for these sorts of items, so that you essentially make them more restrictive. And at least from what I saw, some of the items, are in NS1, which means they will be restricted to quite a few countries. On the other hand, the license exception hopefully will be workable and take away a lot of the licensing onks that I guess a lot of countries would have, that they're making legitimate sales in those countries. So hopefully it'll work. And I do think that it's a good example of the fact that speed is not necessarily the sole should not be the sole driver in this area, that you want to get it right, because these things will be on the books for a long time and they can have unintended consequences that you're trying really hard to avoid.
Yeah, in particular, Tim hits on an important point, which was I think the original rules were caused such heartburn in part because of an overbreadth concern and the fact that they were going to, really restrict, constrain, and do a lot of harm when it came to uh, software that's designed for cyber incident response, vulnerability disclosures, and the like, and things that, as Tim said, are part and parcel of sort of what everybody needs for kind of good cyber hygiene at this point, and the idea that they would be, too heavily restricted, possibly to the point of requiring licenses to be able to export or re-export them even to less heavily controlled countries, what to Wassenaar countries and the like, was a big concern. And so that's clearly a focus of this exercise here, is to make sure that um, the appropriate scope has been brought to bear here, and that we're not in a position where there's going to be kind of too much. The rule is going to sort of do more harm than good. So it will be interesting to see, in particular, what the comments come back on, and whether or not the final rule as implemented in January is going to, assuming that that holds, is going to largely stay intact as it has been put forth in the interim final rule. So we shall see. Again, though, just one last kind of quick thought on that as well is that, again, it's interesting that right around this, in the immediate wake of this, so the rule is rolled out a couple weeks ago, and then we do see some entity list additions that target entities who are, quite frankly, exactly the kinds of entities that are meant to be, to keep these types of items off limits to, right, in countries that are going to be of concern, in all likelihood. And then similarly, today we see OFAC Act there as well. And I think it's just, in the past few months in particular, and I think being brought to a head with everything we've been talking about recently about ransomware, about virtual currencies, about cybersecurity kind of more broadly, the focus that DOJ is bringing to bear on cybersecurity enforcement and cybersecurity investigations. I just think it is um, this is not accidental. Is I think the sort of main not so earth-shattering takeaway that I think I would have from this, but this is really the drumbeat is steady here now when it comes to enforcement and tweaking of the tools to manage, restrict, control, and protect U.S. national security interests when it comes to cybersecurity. I think this is just these three actions, if you want to call them three separate actions, I think just speaks to that even more sort of to the point.
Yeah, the follow through appears to be there in this
Yeah,
area.
exactly. So with that, that's all we want to say on that for now. I think we will likely come back to that at some point, obviously, as that rule gets finalized. But do want to flag that for everybody. And with that, let's pivot to one of our favorite topics and maybe come at it from a slightly different angle than we've talked about recently, which is Huawei.
So, Brian, I don't know if you've heard this, but Huawei is on the entity list.
You don't
Um,
say. I didn't know that.
it's a very it is a very underlooked phenomenon in the export controls and sanctions space. But tonight and today we're going to shine some light
Breaking
on the
news.
entity
Breaking
listing.
news for
Breaking
anybody
news.
who
I
didn't
think
know. Yeah.
we've really cracked this story, and I hope we get credit when people start retweeting it. So Huawei is on the entity list, and as a result, there are serious restrictions on Huawei's ability to get U.S. Origin items, and in fact, the entity listing was modified in a Huawei specific way to make it even harder for Huawei to get items that were produced overseas, making them more likely to be subject to the EAR. Now, what that means is that Huawei can't get these items without a license, and there is a presumption of denial for the license. And in the last week, so none of that is new. Obviously, I was just kidding about the breaking news. But what's happened in the past couple of weeks is that two things. One is a company in China called Seagate has apparently been supplying Huawei with items that other companies believe are subject to the EAR and require a license to supply Huawei with. And that has created a Wall Street Journal report and some outcry, at least among Republican members in Congress, about why it is that Seagate is supposedly violating U.S. law. It's not totally clear that they are. At least the stories that I read suggest that they're violating U.S. law because other companies think that they need a license. And, as we know, sometimes companies are risk averse and go get a license when there's gray area. And sometimes other companies are less risk averse and think that they can comply with the law even without getting a license. So that may be what's going on, but there is some concern that Seagate is avoiding the entity listing and the restrictions on the entity listing by continuing to supply Huawei. That's one part of the development. The other part of the development is that Congress had a report done that suggested that Huawei is still getting licenses for all sorts of U.S. origin goods. I think the number that I saw in the articles was in the tens of billions. It might have even been
It
over
was
60 billion.
over 60
60.
billion.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
what I
in
thought.
in just a 6 month period from late
Yeah.
2020 to early 2021. Yeah.
So lots of U.S. origin goods are going to Huawei pursuant to licenses. And that is consistent with the entity listing because the entity listing doesn't say no U.S. origin goods, period. It says no U.S. origin goods without a license, and there's a presumption of denial for the license. But that has also caused an outcry in Congress. And again, it might be just posturing because the fact is that most of these licenses are, I'm assuming, from U.S. manufacturers who are doing business in China, and so there are U.S. jobs at stake and the U.S. economy at stake. And so, to the extent that the regulators can determine that these particular exports don't have national security implications and thereby continue economic benefits to the U.S. without threatening national security. That's what the licensing regime is supposed to do. And so, you are getting this visibility and transparency into what's happening with Huawei, while at the same time not completely shutting off the flow to Huawei. That's at least in theory, how the entity listing is supposed to work. It increases visibility, it restricts access, but it doesn't deny access. But there is kind of an outcry in Congress, and we may see, legislation, coming at the Commerce Department to try and stop this sort of, these sorts of licenses. Although, at least in the reporting I saw, there was no example of a particular license that was somehow inconsistent with U.S. foreign policy. But I think the big number that we were just talking about is what has people concerned.
Yeah, I would say a couple things. So Seagate obviously, so Seagate's my understanding is they're primarily based in California. So the outcry is in part the fact that this is a U.S. company that's supplying Huawei. Now, I will say, and Tim and I are well aware of many examples where there are U.S. based companies that are supplying companies on the entity list in perfectly legal ways because these are items that are not, in fact, subject to the AR that they're providing them. We don't know at this point, based on what's in the report, the nature of what is actually being provided, whether or not it is in fact subject to the AR. As Tim alluded to, there's the Huawei, special foreign direct product rule that was implemented to really tighten restrictions. We don't know whether or not these were or were not items that were produced abroad that might have been subject to that and thereby caught by the EAR or not. We don't know much, right? This is just a report. We're not taking a view on that whatsoever. All I would like to say on that is it is more complicated than a simple headline that says this company in the US is supplying Huawei, therefore they must be violating the law. That is not necessarily so. We
Right.
know that very well. We know that there are plenty of companies that have US headquarters that have global supply chains that are able to, in certain instances, continue to do business with and supply entity list entities in part because they're providing items that are not subject to the AR. And we don't know what the reality is here. So I just flagged that, number one. Number two is I think the point that Tim just raised about the authorized activities or supply of Huawei, 60 billion plus in a 6 month period that coincidentally bridges both the Trump and the Biden administration. So it's not all this year. It's from fall of 2020 into April of 2021 is when these numbers were run. Also, SMIC as well, that was added to the entity list last year, received apparently 40 billion apparent in exports during that same period, roughly 40 billion. So combined, about 100 billion to two entity list entities that were front and center in the U.S. kind of crackdown on China, so to speak, in the last couple of years. So, you know, taking a very reductive view of all this, it's not surprising that people, and in particular, sort of China hawks, so-called China hawks, are sort of wringing their hands over all this. But I would say, again, as Tim and I know very well, when you approach the Commerce Department for a authorization to export to an entity list entity or a military end user or any of these other kind of categories of end users that are now among the are the most heavily scrutinized, it is no simple feat. There's a lot of care and attention and thought and interagency um, communications that happen to sort of vet those requests and those licenses. And so, again, before anybody's jumping to conclusion here about these raw numbers, I would venture to say, in all likelihood, that I can't guarantee, but would venture to say that the vast majority of these were sort of given, a very careful sort of vetting consideration with all these things in mind. Now, again, perhaps there is, if Congress is unhappy with that, or if others are unhappy with that, then there are things that can be done to perhaps tighten that up, close that up, or perhaps launch investigations of other kinds into what activities remain, what's authorized, what's not authorized. But at the end of the day, when you're granting a license, that's a policy judgment, and if you get a license, then that's the policy judgment of the U.S. government and of the Commerce Department whether to do that or not do that. And obviously, under both a Republican and a Democratic administration, the judgment has been that it is at least permissible in certain circumstances to do that. And as Tim said, presumably this is all to the benefit of U.S. companies. Now, people may not want to hear that or think about that, especially if the big bad Huawei on the other side in China is the beneficiary of that. But that's the reality, is that it's a cost benefit. It's being weighed each time. And it's not as simple as how did this ever happen, and how did we let this happen, and we need to stop it. To me, that's just not the right question. That's not the right consideration. I think it would be interesting to know a bit more about what were these licenses that were granted. I don't know that we'll
Right.
ever get to that, but and again, just in the same way that it would be interesting to know what was the nature of whatever Seagate may have provided and whether that was truly problematic or not, because I'm not presuming that it was necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things on that. I mean, first, I went back and looked at the article. There was a sentence that confused me that seemed to suggest that Seagate was a Chinese company, but apparently it's not, and that doesn't surprise me. But second of all, I I do think that this whole issue comes up a lot with the entity list because I think when people think of quote unquote sanctioned US companies, they think solely of the SDN list, where you just can't have dealings with those companies, and the chances of getting a license to deal with an SDN are often very small. And I've seen it in other contexts as well. With the SSI list, the reporting is often like U.S. party doing business with sanctioned Russian company, and it's like, yeah, but there's all sorts of
They're
things that
they're
you're
allowed
allowed to do
to,
with an
yeah.
SSI in the same way with an entity list entity. There's all sorts of things that you're allowed to do. That doesn't mean that there's, some things that are off limits, but I think that, a lot of US companies decide that it's just not worth the compliance risk to deal with them at all, even though you're allowed to. And so they make a risk based decision not to deal with a company that there's all sorts of legitimate dealings with, and Seagate might have made the other choice. Again, I don't know, exactly what happened in any of these things, and I'm not saying that what Seagate is doing is consistent with the entity listing either. I just don't know, but I do know that there are lots of situations where one company decides that lawfully they can get to yes, and 10 other companies decide, I it's too confusing to me and I just don't want to get it wrong, and so I'm not going to do the business even though I might be able to. And that could easily be what's going on with Seagate.
It certainly could be. I would also say, just as one final thought or note on this, that to your point about the kind of reputational risk, this is literally the Wall Street Journal headline is what people fear and
Right.
what they discuss. and
Right.
and here we are. And the secondary point to that is when that happens, government enforcers notice. And so this is I participated in, I have been part of more than one large government investigation that was kicked off by an article in a, fill in the blank, high profile publication, because some prosecutor somewhere took a look
Right.
and said, hey, we better start looking into this. And so I'm not saying that I have, again, I have no inside knowledge of that. I'm not saying that's what's warranted here necessarily, but that is certainly, of course, what springs to mind as soon as you see something like this.
Well, I mean, I think it's a good reminder that if you're going to be the one when the 10 other companies have decided that it's too risky, you better be sure, because if you can get this sort of publicity, so you may take a reputational hit even if you're not doing anything wrong, and that reputational hit is probably going to result in some sort of scrutiny, either like a formal investigation or at least some close look by the government regulators. And if they take a close look and it still looks bad, you could be in a lot of trouble. So it is dangerous to be the one when the 10 others take the safer route.
Yeah. So with that, let's pivot away there and go to our final sort of main China topic, which is, this will be a quick one, which is China Telecom. So I wanted to, we're kind of getting into territory here that we don't typically cover, which is what used to be known as Team Telecom, which is somewhat near and dear to me, considering that I used to focus on this when I was at the Justice Department, but at least in part. But this is a big deal. What just came out sort of about 2 weeks ago, which is that the FCC announced that it was revoking and terminating China Telecom America's authority to provide telecom services in the U.S. So some may say, "Huh, I'm surprised that China Telecom had that authority in the first place." And for those who don't know, that authority was originally granted many, many years ago, long before this was ever the current U.S.-China dynamic really existed. It was, I think, it's close to 20 years ago that the
Yeah.
original license was granted, and I think the last time it was transferred and looked at was maybe 15 years ago, almost at this point. It was sort of late 2000s. So I think President Bush was still in office at the time. So this is a long time ago. Um, for those who don't know what Team Telecom is or was, I guess it technically doesn't exist anymore because it's been replaced by a new executive order. But Team Telecom was essentially a collection of executive branch agencies chaired by my former colleagues at the Justice Department, focused on national security issues that would receive referrals from the Federal Communications Commission on particular license applications or license holders that potentially presented national security issues. That's in an, I'm oversimplifying, but in a nutshell, that's what it was. It essentially was and now is under the new executive order that's in place, which is EO 13913, which kind of fundamentally reset and reorganized Team Telecom and made it a little more orderly, more organized, and set some time limitations and some other things that people in the industry and the telecom industry have been clamoring for years. That just came about finally in early 2020. Um, in the predecessor to that, in the Team Telecom era, it was a little more informal, and this China Telecom action kind of begins back in that era and then is pulled through all the way till now. And in fact, the executive branch agencies who looked at this and formally weighed in on this recommended the revocation of China Telecom's license. Right, it was, I think it was like within days, if not on the same day of the issuance of the executive order in April 2020. And they weighed in. There's a for those who weren't tracking at the time, there was a press release and some coverage of it at that time in April 2020. This is early days of the pandemic, so maybe many of you might have had other things on your mind at the time, but they weighed in at that time. DOJ and others recommended to the FCC that that China Telecom's existing license be terminated, and then FCC eventually instituted a proceeding late last year to sort of hear from China Telecom and any other interested parties to offer evidence as to perhaps why it should not take that recommended action. And then ultimately, in late October, they have now come down and concluded that they concur in that recommendation, and they are in fact revoking and terminating the license, which gives China Telecom 60 days to basically pick up and get out, for lack of a better term. And I think what's interesting and what I would encourage anybody to do who hasn't looked at this is the FCC has an interesting press release on this, and then a couple of the commissioners weighed in. And it basically, if you look at all of the reasons cited for the action taken, it tracks very closely. And by the way, I would also add that China Telecom, for if it's ringing a bell for other reasons, they're also on the NSCMIC list, the OFAC list for the under 13959. So they have already been identified as a Chinese military industrial complex company that is essentially involved in their case in the ability of the Chinese government to sort of surreptitiously conduct surveillance on Chinese and non-Chinese persons and collect intelligence and engage in espionage activities and the like. So it is sort of all the same types of things that we hear with respect to Huawei, or we hear with respect to other big Chinese telecom and tech companies, quite frankly. But it is this mechanism through the FCC, for those who are not familiar with it, is a powerful one, and it is an important one. And again, as I said, it is now kind of under this umbrella of this new executive order 13913 that sort of reorganized Team Telecom, so to speak, and remains a very powerful tool. It has been a slow-moving tool in the past, but I think with respect to these big Chinese entities, China Telecom and a few others, um, they have been kind of big headline grabbing actions that have taken place. And I think it's just something to be aware of, and another just kind of tool in the toolkit, so to speak, that everybody should be aware of when it comes to the U.S. government's ability to sort of constrain what can be done, especially in the United States. And so when it comes to FCC licenses, this is a powerful tool, and one that, again, I just wanted to sort of flag for everybody. I don't have too much more to add than that, but this is a pretty red letter day when it comes to the use of this tool and the use and this authority when it comes to China Telecom finally getting the boot, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't have much to say about this, but I do want to kind of highlight the national security concerns raised here and compare them to some of the other national security concerns raised in, for example, an entity listing. So the concern here is that China Telecom is in the United States collecting data from U.S. persons, and at least in the time since the Bush administration, the civil military fusion has increased. The level of government control over Chinese private industry has increased, and so the concern is that you've got a Chinese company in the U.S. collecting U.S. data that is then going to be shared with the Chinese government and or the Chinese military, and you combine that with the cyber activity coming from the Chinese government and related agents, and the concern about use of U.S. data against U.S. citizens. This seems like a big deal and a very sensible step, and one that is entirely within U.S. control, or at least much more within U.S. control. The entity listings are done for foreign policy reasons, but a lot of times, if our allies aren't involved, all you do is essentially make the Chinese go to a different supplier, because you have an entity listing that keeps the Chinese from getting U.S. origin goods. But if there are sufficient replacement goods from foreign sources that are not imposing these same sorts of restrictions, you're really not hurting China at all, and you're really not accomplishing your goal. But here, the threat seems a lot more immediate, and the threat seems like one where the U.S. actually can actually crack down on the threat in the way that the entity listings often don't do. I'm not saying that the entity listing doesn't have its place, but I do think that it is a tool that is used a lot, even when it can't be particularly effective. Whereas here, this tool seems like it's not used that often, but it is a much greater danger, and one where they have a chance of being much more effective.
Yeah, and it's a good point of comparison that Tim raises. And the other thing that, and I think I alluded to this just quickly at the outset, it's often compared to a CFIUS-like process where those types of considerations are assessed. And in a perfect world, this is all happening on the front end when there is an application pending or a renewal pending. Of course, this was a stickier situation because there had been a license granted many years ago, sort of before the change in circumstances, and the sort of the threat posed by the civil military fusion and all of the things that are now kind of part and parcel of our of U.S. sort of China policy were not as front and center or not as well kind of developed or understood. And so it bears some resemblance to CFIUS, certainly, in terms of the way that it aims at gathering this information on the front end, potentially mitigating risks when possible, or perhaps precluding if it requires preclusion or termination, as is the case here. So that's, I think, the most relevant analog in many ways, although the processes are not exactly the same. But that's just for those, again, who are unfamiliar, something to just kind of be aware of. And I do think, frankly, this is going to be an area where we see more activity, and we have already seen more activity, quite frankly, since the new executive order was put into place last year. So something to keep an eye on and not lose sight of as we move forward. So with that, let's leave China briefly before we come back to it in the lightning round, and let's go to Turkey and talk about Halkbank for a
Turkey,
second.
we'll talk about Turkey and a little bit of Iran. This was the Iran teaser as well.
Yeah.
So Halkbank is a Turkish state-owned bank. Its name came up quite a bit a few years ago in the trial of one of its executives, Mr. Attila. And Mr. Attila's case was probably in some ways overshadowed by Mr. Zarab's case, but Mr. Zarab never went to trial. He wound up cooperating with the government and being the star witness in the case against the Halkbank executive. And what was described there was a plan using Halkbank in part to essentially transfer oil reserves or money that was in a Turkish bank based on, when as part of the Iran sanctions, there is a significant reduction exception that certain countries can get. And if they get that significant reduction exception, they're allowed to buy Iranian oil for a certain amount of time. and but what they have to do with the proceeds is essentially lock it up in a local bank, Halk Bank being the bank here that where these reserves were locked up, and it can only be used by the Iranians to buy food and medicine. And the allegation in the Attila case was that that was not what was happening. That essentially that Halk Bank with Zarab and Attila were funneling the money back to Iran in the guise in food and medicine sales, but there was a lot more going on than that. And Zarab had been kind of the person who was the mastermind of this, and Attila was it was working with the bank to do this. And all the while, as OFAC was watching, they were making false statements to OFAC as to what they were doing. And again, I'm probably oversimplifying, but that's the gist of the case against Attila, and it's now the gist of the case against Halk Bank, which is charged in, I believe it's SDNY,
Yeah, correct.
with money laundering, making false statements to OFAC about this, and I believe
IEPA
substantive
violations.
sanctions
Yeah.
violations under IEPA.
Yep.
And so Halk Bank, because it is a state-owned entity, moved to dismiss on the ground of sovereign immunity, and it lost. And after it lost in the district court, sovereign immunity is one of the few issues that there's often is subject to the collateral order doctrine, so you can take an interlocutory appeal before you've actually been convicted. And so Halk Bank tried to take that appeal, and the Second Circuit allowed the appeal to go forward. But one of the issues in the case was whether or not the collateral order doctrine even applied to this sort of sovereign immunity type appeal. The Second Circuit said that it did. But then after finding that it did, it took on Halk Bank's main contention, which was that because the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act does not have an explicit exception allowing suits against foreign sovereigns for criminal acts, that at least by negative reference, that law was meant to not allow criminal cases to be brought against foreign sovereigns. The Second Circuit didn't decide that issue, at least writ large, because essentially what Alkbag wanted to say is you can't charge any state-owned entity or any foreign state in the U.S. courts in a criminal case. The Second Circuit said no, you can, or at least they kept open the idea that you could, but they said that you certainly could if the conduct fits within one of the other Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act exceptions. And here, the exception that it fit within, according to the Second Circuit, was the commercial activity exception, because essentially what they said was these are just banking claims. These are just, you when Turkey decided to set up a state-owned bank, if the state-owned bank, conducted itself through standard commercial banking activities that any bank could do, then it became subject to the commercial activity exception of the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which allows the U.S. courts to consider claims where against sovereign entities if they are engaging in certain commercial activity. And so it had the potential to be a really big case, and to the extent that it had decided that foreign sovereigns were immune from criminal liability in the U.S. court. It didn't go that far, and it didn't actually resolve that issue at all. But it still was an important case, because I think it is similar in some ways to what was happening in Huawei with Mrs. Meng. So there was a real discussion there of what are these lawsuits about. And in that one, the claim by Mrs. Meng was that it was a sanctions case. And because Canada didn't have the same sort of Iran sanctions regime, that it wasn't extraditable because it wasn't really a sanctions case, and the government took the position, no, it's just a fraud case. And here it's kind of similar. The government's taking the position that this is not about the state doing anything wrong. This was not actions by the Turkish state. This was just a bank that happened to be owned by the government, but they were doing things that were improper with respect to banking, just the same as a private bank could do. And so therefore they don't get any more immunity than a private bank would. And so again, we've had some rulings that are really getting at the heart of what a sanctions violation is, and I think it really is the trend now to fit sanctions within the more broad general framework, in part because our sanctions laws are so much broader than anybody else's.
Yeah. So a couple of things here. So I think Tim brings up a good point, which is, uh, if this had gone out, if this had come out the other way, this would obviously be a much bigger deal, and could have really done quite a bit of damage to a lot of the the sort of underpinnings of U.S. certainly criminal sanctions, um,
Well, the FCPA.
prosecution. Right. I mean, right. Even beyond the way IEPA gets applied in terms of the sanctions context, FCPA and otherwise could have done a lot of, really could have upended that. And perhaps that's a little too much weight to bear on the other side if this were to come out that way. Although this was found, was decided on relatively narrow grounds. It is, like Tim said, it's just the question of whether the commercial activity exception applies here. And the court found clearly that it did. I would note that I think there's a pending request for hearing en banc at the Second Circuit, so that's still TBD whether that'll happen. Obviously, they could try to take it up to the Supreme Court as well. Hats off to the lawyers who brought this, who I know very well at Williams and Connolly, so I wouldn't count them out, but it looks like this may be, this issue may have run its course, at least for now. And so obviously that's also significant because it paves the way potentially for the Hawk Bank trial to happen at some point next year. Although I think the timing of that's a little uncertain. But I think to me the bigger takeaways here are kind of what this could have signaled, or what I think is instructive for potential future cases like this, as Tim mentioned, with respect to, not that this would sort of squarely be the case with Huawei, but with other, certainly with Chinese banks, you could see this being the case, or other financial institutions. I think this is significant, and is going to be a difficult hurdle for any state-owned banks to overcome in the future, in part for a couple of reasons. I'll just read a couple quick excerpts. So in terms of looking at the applicability of the commercial activity exception, the Second Circuit noted that whether a foreign state acts in the manner of a private party to engage in commercial activity is thus a question of behavior, not motivation. So it's essentially just an objective look at the way that the bank was conducting itself with regard to the charged conduct here. And it goes down and sort of notes that, um, although Hawk Bank's a majority owned by the government of Turkey, it was having communications, as Tim noted, with OFAC that are plainly the type of activity in which banks, including privately owned correspondent banks, routinely engage. And so, as they had noted in another case where they were talking about a potential foreign sovereign immunity claim in the context of copyright infringement, they observed literally anyone can do copyright infringement, so too can literally any bank violate sanctions. And so the fact that you are a state-owned bank does not necessarily put you in some exclusive category that takes you out of consideration, and sort of immunizes that type of normal run-of-the-mill commercial financial activity that all banks have to engage in, and that they may involve the U.S., whether directly or as an effect thereof. And that still, I think, pretty squarely is preserved here now as a result of this. And so I think to me that's kind of the most interesting little kernel in here, is that as we look at whatever the next case will be, or the next case will be, because this is clearly an argument that is not going to necessarily go away when it comes to these types of cases, to the extent that they are being litigated to the full extent and potentially prepared for trial. That's sort of that's an interesting little kind of element of this that I think is going to remain, and it's going to be a difficult thing to reckon with, quite frankly, in the future for other SOEs who may be looking at bringing similar challenges under Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act grounds.
Yeah, and just to give Williams and Conley their due, and to set the stage for the possibility that this could either go up to the Supreme Court or could be a candidate for en banc review. I mean, the argument was, the when you see the opinion, it's like, well, yeah, they're just acting like a bank. But there actually were arguments on the other side. I mean, part of the reason I went through that discussion about the NDAA and the significant reduction exception was because that was only available to
To
countries.
governments.
And
Yep.
so you've got it. There is this governmental function in the background that was really what this scheme, in the government's view, this scheme
Was
was
premised
predicated
upon.
on,
Yep.
was that you had to be to do this, you had to be a country, which it does kind of take it out of the realm of, well, anybody could violate a copyright. Yeah, anybody can engage in this action, but in order to get your admission to the club to engage in this action, you had to be a government. And so there is some sort of government function going on in the background, which is what made the argument pretty powerful. Again, the opinion doesn't read that way. Certainly this court wasn't persuaded by that, but I could see other judges being persuaded by that argument.
Right. No, that's a very good point. Very good point. So, in any event, we'll leave that for now. But an interesting recent opinion that we wanted to flag. We'll keep an eye on that. I'm sure that we may. We I think we haven't talked about this case in a while since it sort of became active. But I would imagine that if it does continue on toward trial, we'll obviously be keeping a close watch. And if there's anything that comes of this ruling, we'll I'm sure come back to it. So with that, let's wrap. That's our main portion of the show for today, and then I will pause for the lightning round sound effect. And we only have one lightning round topic for today, which brings us back to China, and in particular, something we talked about last time, which is Taiwan. And so we talked a little bit about the simmering tensions with respect to Taiwan and the U.S. and China, and sort of the staring contest that is developing, or the slightly scarier version of a staring contest that's developing with respect to China and the U.S. and Taiwan. The most recent sort of relevant wrinkle in this, and it's not a new wrinkle, but it is one that has gotten a little bit of publicity in the recent days, which is why I flag it, is the idea that Taiwan should become a full member of the UN. And the US is supportive of this. China is adamantly opposed to this. There have been a number of think pieces and articles that have kind of been written about this in recent days. And again, we sort of teed this up the last time in part because I think it's an interesting thought exercise at this point to say, there are those who are writing about potential armed conflict when it comes to Taiwan if China were to invade, and would the U.S. come to defend them? And President Biden has said that the U.S. would. But I think in the sort of diplomatic sanctions, other kind of trade related measures that on the chessboard and in the toolkit that we focus on mostly, I think that's kind of where our heads tend to go immediately on this. And so the UN is kind of an interesting wrinkle in part because it's obviously playing into um, there's a democratic principles issue, there's human rights, there's some of the other things that I also saw there was sort of, not that this is directly related, but the State Department issued some statements in the past week or so that were poking China's eye again about Hong Kong because of some additional activities in Hong Kong and the national security law and the degradation of democracy and free speech and et cetera. And it's kind of all, again, it's kind of all it's all of a piece. Not, even though it seems a bit different, it's not all that different than what we opened the pod with. But I guess just wanted to tee some of that up for your consideration, Tim, and if you think there's anything more here or anything that I think we're going to hear again. There's going to be kind of a steady stream of these kinds of Taiwan related stories, and I think sooner or later one of them is going to unfortunately result in some kind of action that is going to be taken perhaps more harshly by one side or the other. But just thought that this was worth 90 seconds of our time to think about here and to close the show.
Yeah, so just a few thoughts. So first, reading back through the materials and particularly the legislative history arising out of this and from the 70s, it was interesting to me to see that this apparently is where the doctrine of strategic ambiguity, the formal doctrine of it, came from, which, as I
One of our
understand,
favorite,
or
our
one of our
favorite
favorite.
and least favorite doctrines all at the same
Right,
time. Yeah.
OFAC has taken that and run with it, but apparently back in the 70s, this was the official, and still is. There's a law that adopted it. The official policy of the United States is to make China think that if it were to invade Taiwan, we would come to its aid, but at the same time to make Taiwan think that if China were to invade, we wouldn't come to its aid, or at least to leave enough ambiguity that neither Taiwan nor China knows what would happen in the case that China invaded. Now, I will say that even though that appears to be the legislative policy of the U.S., President Biden seems to have eliminated the ambiguity with respect to China at the very least, and to Taiwan, I guess. I mean, by saying multiple times now that if China were to invade, the U.S. would come to its aid. There's not much ambiguity there, which is why apparently his advisors have come back afterward and say no change in policy. The policy is still the same, although that doesn't sound exactly right since the policy was to be ambiguous on this and he was not ambiguous. But all that said, um, I think you put your finger on it, Brian. this is what we saw happen in Hong Kong, and I think that for a while China was testing with this national security law in Hong Kong and seeing what would happen, and saw that the most that would happen would be there would be a sanctions program that may or may not be effective, but certainly does not seem to have deterred China in much of any way with respect to Hong Kong. And I think what we're seeing now with Taiwan is kind of the similar sort of testing. Now, Taiwan is a little bit different in the sense that, with Hong Kong, China had actual physical control over Hong Kong. It just had, at least for a while, honored this agreement where there were two systems, and so Hong Kong had a separate system, but physically it was within Chinese control. Taiwan is a little bit different because it's not physically within in China's control, at least not now. Although China is very close and has a very big army, and so it is a dangerous situation for Taiwan. But we'll see what happens in terms of escalating the pressure, and we'll see what happens from the U.S. side in terms of how much, how willing it is to take steps to protect Taiwan's economy, and how able it is to take those steps. I mean, it is an interesting scenario where Taiwan is literally right on China's doorstep, and the U.S. is still saying that it's in our national interest to essentially stop China from going after Taiwan, and whether that turns out to be true or whether it turns out to be posturing, I guess we're just going to see.
Yeah, I just think it's again, this is and maybe we'll give it a rest on the next episode, but I do think that we've kind of reached a bit of a flashpoint on this where we're close to a tipping point, and I think this is going to be a big issue that we are going to be wrestling with on the trade compliance side before too long because of actions that are right
Absolutely.
now unforeseen. But it is just to anybody out there who is kind of sleeping on this situation. I would certainly encourage you not to be because it feels very much like we are on the precipice here, and that there are some things that may be coming soon. Um, Probably for ill in the first instance that everybody's going to have to be aware, react to and be vigilant about, and the policymakers and others are going to, take a lot of, um, are likely going to, spring into action. So I think it's just that's part of the reason why we want to just flag it again very quickly.
It's a thorny problem. I mean, on the one hand, Taiwan is a democracy, a longtime U.S. ally, protects human rights. On the other hand, I mean, China has a legitimate interest in um, geographic territories that are that close to its doorstep, and historically has it was the Chinese government that went into exile in Taiwan. So it's complicated from the Chinese perspective. It's complicated from the U.S. perspective because on the one hand, I think our instinct would be to say it's so much a part of China, China should be allowed to deal with it. On the other hand, we don't want to abandon a democratic ally in that region. And so I think it's very hard, and I think you're right that ultimately what hard issues often get resolved in U.S. policy by saying, well, we're gonna impose trade sanctions and see how that works.
Press releases from the State Department are not going to do the trick, I think. So we'll have to see we'll have to see where we go from here. But in any event, let's leave that for now. That's a wrap for today. That is our show. Thanks to everybody for joining again. This will be up some point, hopefully late this week. Again, we may or may not be back with one more before the end of the month, depending on how Thanksgiving schedules here in the U.S. or in Canada, in Tim's case,
In Canada,
may align. Um,
I can confirm it will be Thanksgiving schedules in
Thanksgiving
Canada.
in Canada. Very difficult to get recording time up in Canada around Thanksgiving. It's just a flood of Americans that are up there recording podcasts.
We can make the time. We
Um,
can make the time.
but in any event, thanks to everybody again, and until next time, stay safe and stay sanctions free. Thanks everybody.
Stay sanctions
All right,
free,
bye.
everybody.